Tycoon Noir. My powerful boss number 4. Something wrong? Mr. Stone's voice was flat, cutting through the silence like a blade. I swallowed hard, my fingers fumbling with the clasp of the leather collar. Suddenly my hands felt clumsy, useless. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of something relief on his face. He reached for the collar, but I pulled it away before he could touch it. His frown deepened, and he sat up straighter, putting distance between us. Put it on, put it on, put it on. The words screamed in my head. I wanted to do it, to clasp it around my neck and say yes to him, to everything he was offering. But fear paralyzed me. Why was it so hard to say yes? He reached out, his fingers steadying my trembling hands. His eyes locked onto mine, intense and unyielding, as though he could see straight through me, right to the secret I was keeping. A secret darker than anything he could imagine. Give me an answer, he growled, his voice low and commanding. The silence between us stretched. All I could hear was the wind rustling through the trees and the distant crash of waves on the shore. My mind screamed for time, just a little more time. A minute, another, and another. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to speak. I can't wear it. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. I heard him shift off the bed, the sound of his bare feet against the hardwood floor. When I opened my eyes, he was dressing, buttoning his shirt with deliberate movements. My own nakedness suddenly felt raw, vulnerable. He paused halfway, looking down at the floor with an expression so pained, it made my chest tighten. I wanted to reach out, to throw my arms around him and promise that I'd wear the collar, that I'd say yes. But I didn't move. Can you tell me why? He asked, his voice low, controlled, like a volcano on the verge of eruption. Of course, I could tell him. I could tell him how his company had nearly destroyed my hometown, leaving families broken and futures uncertain. I could tell him that I'd joined his company not for the job, but for revenge. And then somehow, he'd taken my heart, stripping away my resolve piece by piece. But if I told him the truth, I might lose everything. I'm not ready, I said at last, shame heating my face. A single tear escaped, sliding down my nose and landing on the bed. I clenched my fists, willing myself not to cry, not in front of him. He reached for me, pulling me into his arms. The warmth of his body and the strength of his embrace only made the pain sharper, and a half-sob escaped my lips. Kneeling before me, he brushed my tears away with his lips, each touch soft and reverent. I need you, Delilah, he said quietly. His words were raw, unguarded. Then he stood and moved away, retrieving a thick white robe from a drawer beneath the bed. He handed it to me, his face unreadable, calm, almost stoic. I couldn't tell if he was angry, disappointed, or something else entirely. My chest ached with the weight of unspoken words. The whirlwind of mind-melting intimacy, followed by this storm of emotions, had left me drained. All I wanted now was the comfort of his presence, to be near him for just a little longer. I slipped on the robe, tying it tightly around myself, and he motioned for me to follow. Without a word, I rose and trailed behind him, unsure of what would come next. We left the maze, and with every step on the grass I found myself actually calming. The high walls of the maze were thick green, and the grass was soft and cool. We walked in silence, but the anxious part of my mind seemed to have disconnected somewhat. My rambling thoughts were as distant as the ocean waves. As we walked towards the mansion, I noticed a small red mud brick house built into the garden. It had vines twining through it and blue flowers dangling down from the roof. That's an unusual building. I built it, he said, not turning around. For someone I knew a lifetime ago, he added. I wanted to ask more, but we were soon at the mansion, and I followed him up the steps and inside. Everything seemed out of place now. The carpet too thick, the lights too bright. Even the polished wood floor seemed to be freezing. He stopped at the foot of the stairs and turned around. There is a driver out front who will take you wherever you want. I need to go now. Mr. Stone stepped closer, and I just wanted to wrap my arms around him and hold him, but it wasn't to be. He caressed the back of my neck, and then quickly kissed me on the cheek before turning away. He walked away, looking like he was back in standard Mr. Stone mode, but I could see my refusal had wounded him. I dressed in all of 2 minutes, and then flew out the front door like I was late for the ball. Mr. Henry smiled at me, and I forced one in return. How many girls had he seen running out of this mansion? The driver turned out to be a petite Japanese woman named Mio who bowed, and then surprised me with a French-Canadian accent. "And the car?" "A limo. Where will I be taking you today?" she asked once I was inside. I gave her my address, and then sat back on in the chair feeling that the limo was a cruel joke. This really was like the ball in reverse. I'd been with my dark and damaged prince, and now I was returning alone to my average life, having broken his heart. We left the mansion, the wheels crunching on the gravel, and I didn't look back even once. I couldn't bear it. Mio soon started chatting as we drove, and I found her accent soothing. We were soon talking about our hometowns, and she told me about her Japanese mother and Canadian father, who met while in Berlin as students. I got lost in her stories, and by the time we reached my apartment block, I was actually laughing. She winked at me before driving away, and standing there in front of my building in the warm sun, life's problems suddenly didn't seem so bad. I opened all the curtains in my tiny apartment and let the light stream in. Scavenged bookshelf, fading sofa and a decor by IKEA, but it was home. I had a shower and found myself thinking about Mr. Stone in a distant abstract kind of way. It was like I'd run out of emotions, both good and bad. I smiled at the memory of chasing through the maze, and then the crazy sex that followed, and felt a distant pull of sadness when I turned down Mr. Stone, but I didn't cry. I dried myself and dressed in comfortable jeans and a faded t-shirt I'd had since I was 16. I sat on my sofa and flicked through channels with the television on mute. Things were happening in the world, but I was watching them without seeing. Somehow the crazy ups and downs had exhausted me enough that I could think logically through this all. Tell Mr. Stone the truth, and let happen whatever would happen. Wear the collar and tell him the truth later on. Don't wear the collar and never tell him the truth. Wear the collar and never tell him the truth. The anger that had driven me to join Stone Black was still there, but my feelings for Mr. Stone had pushed it away. But what did that mean? Stone Pharma had pumped some bad stuff into the groundwater, and people had gotten very sick. Some other branch of their company, running a quarry on the side of town, had followed this up with some illegal dumping of their own that virtually guaranteed no crops would grow for 50 years. Sick people plus no farming, and Bedford had changed from a thriving town to a blip on the road people didn't bother to stop at. Was I saying that because I was fucking Mr. Stone I didn't care what had happened? But I wanted him. I turned the television volume on and watched a show where an English couple transformed a dilapidated barn into a stunning modern house. Everything followed so neatly, and their problems were easily overcome. I found myself wishing life could be that way. Sometime that night my emotions returned, and with them 1,000 thoughts of Mr. Stone. Him caressing me, pulling me across the bed, brushing a crop over my inner thigh. I found myself getting hot and bothered and wishing he was here with me. I took myself to the kitchen and drank a glass of water, chilled with floating ice cubes. The cold helped, but the sound of the clinking ice cubes didn't. Mr. Stone sitting in his chair by firelight, and me standing naked before him. Mr. Stone bending me over the sofa. I managed to make it to bed without touching myself, but it was a close thing. Sunday went by in a blur of domestic tasks and moments when I found myself fantasizing about Mr. Stone. In the vegetable section of the supermarket, I saw a rather large carrot, and then quickly walked myself around to stand in front of the dairy case to cool down after my brain served up scenes of Mr. Stone, naked with his thick cock sticking out in front of him. It was ridiculous and frustrating and hot and stupid all at once. I felt hot and stupid, and by the time I was home in the late afternoon, I'd decided I'd tell him the truth. I'd dress as sexy as hell, walk into his office without asking, and tell him where I was from and why. It was some sort of plan, right? I arrived at the office the next day dressed in red heels, a black skirt, white blouse and black cardigan. It doesn't sound like much, but with the support bra underneath, and just a touch of makeup, I was Babin. The dark mahogany doors to Mr. Stone's office were closed, so I sat down, turned on my computer, pretending this was just some other day. Was he on the other side behind that giant desk of his? Would he call me in? I saw Mr. Stone's name in my email and smiled, but it was a straight work request. Pull all the contracts and correspondence for BSU between January and March of last year. BSU? Where did I know that name from again? Oh, right. Mr. Stone asked me questions about their stock prices, and then told me something about them admitting their solar technology wasn't as good as they claimed. Then that night he took me to dinner. And home. And then I stood in front of his fire. No. I squeezed my eyes shut, and shook myself like a puppy getting out of bath. I couldn't let myself get caught up in thinking about Mr. Stone, or I'd just end up sitting here all hot and bothered. And what if he called me in then? Ms. Green, the phantom HR manager who I never saw, had taught me to use the record system, but back then I'd only had surface access. Now I had full access. Or as Mr. Stone had told me, "You're going to be given access to our systems as though you were me." I opened the records program, relieved to find that now I had a new task. Mr. Stone was the last thing on my mind. Every few hours I'd get a new email from Mr. Stone, and the work started piling up. Find all the emails between one subsidiary company and another and highlight every mention of the word integral process. Advise how many millions of Great British pounds were purchased by Stoneblack as a currency fluctuation hedge over the last 6 years, broken down by month. As I dived deep into the world of contracts and data, the size and complexity of Stoneblack became apparent to me. I'd seen the organizational chart given out to all new employees, but it was just a few boxes and lines. Stoneblack was more like a web, and just when I thought I had started to get a grip on it, I'd receive another email and find new layers on layers. I was so absorbed in my task that I didn't realize I'd read Bedford and Stone Pharma until I was halfway through a stack of emails. I was highlighting all correspondence from an employee named Andrew Pano, who was one of the in-house legal counsel 10 years ago. I slowed down and went back over what I'd found. Mr. Pano was requesting information about the value of research being conducted at Stone Pharma at the time of the fire that had destroyed the building. They'd been compensated for the building and the materials inside, but it appeared the insurance agency had fought until the bitter end on the value of research that hadn't yet been published or used. The gist of his emails was that now they had commercialized the research and found it to be worth at least $500 million a year, that it was time to go back to the insurance company for more money. He was arguing it out with a manager at Stone Corporation, who was telling him it wasn't worth the time and effort, just for a few million. I went through all the records in this file desperate to find more information, but there wasn't much more. They'd argued about it for a few more emails, and then there was nothing else apart from a few thousand old emails that had corrupted and were filled with gibberish. I caught myself breathing hard as I looked up at the ceiling and tried to calm myself down. It was a dead end, but it was the first time I'd found an actual mention of my hometown and Stone Pharma. My stomach chose that moment to rumble, and I was shocked to find it was after 2 in the afternoon. As soon as I realized I was hungry, I was starving. I dashed out of the office and found the nearest cafe. After a wait of approximately 4.6 million years, I had my sandwich and was soon unwrapping it in the small park a little further down the road. As soon as I took the edge off my hunger, I suddenly realized I'd rushed out of the office without even thinking of Mr. Stone. I still had no idea if he was on the other side of those big mahogany doors or not. On the other side of the park I saw a couple kissing. Well, making out actually. He was tall and dressed in a black business suit, and she was shorter, and I guessed a few years younger than him. She was wearing a striped dress that showed off some curves. I found my temperature going up as he ran his hands over her. They parted with a final passionate kiss where she pulled him down by his tie. He briefly grabbed her hair and kissed the side of her neck, and then they pulled apart. She smirked at him while he adjusted his suit to hide what was in his pants. I'll go back and walk into his office. I won't let him talk. I'll grab his shirt and kiss him like that girl just kissed her man. I stood up, already feeling myself getting wet. This was going to be fun. By the time I reached the top floor, my entire body was humming with tension. I wanted Mr. Stone. I wanted him right now, and I didn't care about the consequences. I dropped my bag on my desk and strolled over to the doors. I took a second to adjust my clothing and then pushed the doors open. I was going to fuck his brains out. except the office was empty. I was about to swear in disappointment when I saw something sitting on the desk that took my breath away. It was the leather collar. I approached his desk and the collar, and had that squirmy, crazy feeling rise up within me. I felt like I was back in his secret dungeon surrounded by sex toys. The doors closed behind me, and I found myself standing in front of his desk looking at the collar, my heart pounding. I picked it up and felt the supple leather warm almost instantly to my touch. This time my fingers were cooperating, and I unclasped the collar before stopping and holding my breath. I wanted to put it on. I wanted to wear his collar. I wanted him to fuck me while I wore it. I wanted to be owned. I reached down with one hand and pressed my fingers against my sex. I was so hot and wet, and I couldn't help myself moan at the pressure. I heard a soft click behind me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin, but there was no one there. I rushed over to the door and found it was locked. I gave you very specific instructions, Ms. Neri. His voice surrounded me. Hidden speakers. He was watching. I whipped the collar behind my back, my face burning red, and heard him laugh. Stand in the middle of the room, little slave, he commanded. I felt a thrill of anticipation run through me, and an image of him spanking me while bent over his desk arose in my mind. Now, he commanded. I scurried to the middle of the room, my heart thudding once more in my chest. Of course he would have cameras in here. He wanted to be in control. There was another click and automatic blinds lowered, blocking out the bright sunny day. As they did, dim indirect lights glowed on, casting warm shadows around the room. A brighter light turned on above me. I was standing in a spotlight like I was a performer up on stage. You must make amends for your disobedience, Mr. Stone said, his voice low. Do as I say and the consequences will be light. I squeezed the collar in my hands and swallowed. Yes, sir. Take off your clothes. Still holding the leather collar in my hand, I took off my cardigan and unbuttoned my blouse with trembling fingers. I unzipped my skirt and stepped out of my heels. I slipped out of my pantyhose, and then I was left in my bra and underwear. I undid the clasp of the bra and dropped it to the ground next to me, just like I had when I saw him in the center of the maze. My nipples were hard and pointing out, and the rasp of the fabric across them made me catch my breath. Finally, I hooked my fingers in the sides of my underwear and slipped them off. I dropped them on my pile of clothes and stood up, completely naked, the leather collar in my hand. Pinch your nipples, little slave, he said. I raised my trembling hands to my breasts and took a nipple between each thumb and forefinger. I still had the leather collar in my left hand, and it brushed against my body. He hadn't told me to put it on or to put it down, so I held it as I obeyed his instructions. I felt twin lines of pleasure running down my body to my sex as I gently pinched and teased my nipples. I wanted to ask if he was here, if he'd come rushing in from the room on the side of his office, but I stayed silent. I would follow his instructions. Put your red heels on, little slave, and turn around for me, he said. I stepped into my heels and felt a rush of heat as I saw myself reflected in the shiny surfaces as I moved on the spot. I saw the wild look in my eye, my nipples red and jutting in my sex hot and wet. Sit in my chair, he commanded. The light above his chair increased in intensity to form another spotlight. I walked over there, unable to stop my hips swinging lasciviously. I felt bad. I wanted to be bad. I sat down on the soft, cool leather, feeling the texture of it against my ass. Put your heels on the edge of the desk, Mr. Stone said. His voice sounded darker, more intense, and I wondered if he had his cock out. Was he touching it as he watched me? I pulled myself back in the chair and put my heels up on the edge of the desk. I had to scoot my ass forward, and in this position, I naturally tilted back and my legs opened. Well, a little. I spread my legs to show my sex to Mr. Stone. You like this, don't you, little slut? It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Yes, sir. My voice was high and breathy, like I'd been running. I had my hands clenched on the arms of the chair, wanting to reach down to touch myself, willing myself to hold on until he commanded me to. There was a click from the desk beside me, and the middle drawer slid out. Resting in a foam indentation was a thick gold vibrator of the soft jelly type. It looked familiar. Lick the tip, he commanded. I reached over, and removed the vibrator before shuffling myself back into position. I raised it to my lips and closed my eyes as I slid it into my mouth. It was his cock. It was the same shape and size, and some part of my brain, not spinning crazy from being so horny, made some comment about what mad billionaires get up to just to fill the days. I slid the cock back and forth, running my tongue over it, imagining it was Mr. Stone. It wasn't hard with his scent all around me, and the recent memory of it to help me along. "Take it out of your mouth and turn it on," he said. I opened my eyes as I pulled the cock out of my mouth. It was like I was drugged or something. My eyelids felt heavy and most thought had vanished. I was trapped in this moment, following his instructions. The base of the vibrator turned, and a low hum filled the room. I felt my fingers vibrating, the sensation running down my arm. "Touch your clit with my cock," he said. I swear my temperature jumped a few degrees at the sound of his voice. I lowered the vibrator, wanting to touch it against my nipple, but knowing he hadn't given me that instruction. I felt a spring winding inside me as the tip of the cock touched my clit. The buzzing vibration flowed out from the center of me, and I pressed down harder, letting out an involuntary moan. "Show me how much you love my cock," Mr. Stone said. I began slowly moving the vibrating cock around my clit, and then down so it rubbed against my wet pussy. I resisted pushing it into me, although all I wanted was to feel stretched out by it. Down and up and back to my clit. Down and up and back to my clit. My gasps became moans and my moans became short breaths in sighs. Muscles inside me began to twitch uncontrollably, and I silently begged him permission to come. He must have read my mind, because I heard his voice over my gasps. "Come for me, little slave." As soon as he gave permission, my body lost control. I rubbed the vibrating cock against my clit as a wave of tension rose, and then broke over me. My heels jarred on the side of the desk as my legs trembled. "Fuck it," he said. I moaned through my orgasm and pushed the cock into me. I was so wet it slid straight in, the cool jelly warming quickly. I pushed down on the cock, and the tip inside me pushed upwards, still vibrating. Oh God, I loved this position. To have Mr. Stone over me with his cock buried deep in my pussy, pressing my legs back against my chest. I pulled the cock out of me and slid it back in with another gasp. My orgasm had stretched out, and this new buzzing from inside threatened to undo me completely. "I want you to scream for me, little slave," Mr. Stone commanded. There was a click to my right, and a black wall screen turned on. I saw myself from above, my legs spread obscenely with red heels on the side of Mr. Stone's desk. I was fucking myself with the vibrator, and my face and body were flushed red. Then the image changed to a naked man only seen from the thighs up to his chest. It was Mr. Stone. I moaned as I saw him grip his throbbing cock and stroke it in time to me fucking myself. "Scream for me," he commanded, and I let go entirely. I screamed in pleasure as I came, my legs moving together and apart, and my hips jolting uncontrollably. I heard Mr. Stone give a sharp intake of air, and then I saw him come, a powerful hot stream shooting out of his cock. I wanted it, wanted him to be here with me fucking me. Finally the waves of pleasure diminished, and I slipped the vibrator out of me, feeling a final burst of warmth as the tip of it touched my sensitive clit. My eyelids were doubly heavy now, and through my unfocused vision, I saw Mr. Stone stand up before the screen shut off, returning to black. "You have done well, little slave. Get dressed and go." He was breathing heavily, and I smiled at the idea of him coming from watching me fucking myself with a vibrator. I turned it off and dropped it back into its drawer. Then I pushed myself away from the desk and stood up, my legs wobbling like jelly. Through all that I'd kept hold of the leather collar in my hand, and I was tempted to put it on, just for him. He must have read my mind again. "Leave the collar," he commanded, his voice returning to normal. I placed it on the desk, and then used it to help myself walk around the other side. As I got dressed, the blinds rose, and the lights returned to full strength. By the time I was buttoning my blouse, the office was bright and airy, and you could almost believe nothing had happened here. I looked up at the ceiling where there had to be a camera. I couldn't see it, but I knew Mr. Stone was still watching. When I heard the lock of his door click open, I looked up and blew him a kiss. Then I poked out my tongue and got the hell out of there before he had a chance to lock the door. As it closed behind me, I heard him laugh. I spent a few minutes in the ladies' room on the bottom floor to cool myself off before leaving the building. My neck and cheeks seemed determined to stay flushed with spots of red, no matter what. And in the mirrored elevator on the way down, I saw myself looking precisely like a girl who'd just had some spectacular orgasms. A young clean-cut man in a suit did a bit of a double take when he saw me, and then smiled to himself all the way to the lobby. Once I was outside, it got a little better. It was still mid-afternoon, getting close to 4, and there was a cool breeze sweeping down the street. I knew I didn't officially finish until 5, but there was no way I could stay in the office after what had just happened. I walked down the street towards my bus stop grinning like an idiot the whole way. The next day at the office was filled with more emailed tasks from Mr. Stone, and I got through most of the day without being sidetracked by thoughts of him. I didn't find any more information on business in my hometown, and I wasn't yet ready to start snooping around without direct instruction just yet. I don't know why I thought this, but some part of me started to believe that whatever Stone Black had done, Mr. Stone hadn't been involved. I had no reason for this idea except that it seemed at odds with the direction the company had taken under his control. They were working in solar technology, and even had a branch working on plastics reclamation. There were many fingers and many pies, but it seemed at least a good half of them were not, well, evil. Strictly speaking, I say that I didn't think of Mr. Stone much, but I did think a few things, and then found the door to his office locked when I tried it. Damn. I returned from lunch, again at the cafe that took approximately 4.6 million years to make a sandwich, to find a pale golden A4 envelope sitting on my desk. I sat down and tried to wipe the silly grin off my face. I had to get a hold of myself. I picked up the envelope and smelt his scent, and bam, back came that silly grin. I opened it to find an invitation. Saturday 7 p.m. Mia will pick you up on Saturday to go shopping. You will need a dress, shoes, and something sexy. Do not disobey me. I shivered when I read that last line, and immediately planned on how I could disobey him in some way. His office was locked, so I couldn't go in there again. He was out of the office, and it looked like I wouldn't see him until Saturday night. I'd just have to improvise that night. The rest of the week zipped by in a blur of work, and soon it was Saturday. I spent the morning half doing housework and half watching home renovation shows. I'd just finished a late lunch when Mio rang and told me she'd be downstairs in 15 minutes. I quickly changed into what could be called my best casual clothes, and then spend the rest of the time thinking I should just dress in my business clothes. I'm sure Mr. Stone wouldn't be sending Mio in a limo just to take me to Kmart. I met Mio downstairs and found her standing beside a pitch-black Bentley wearing a tweed cap, white shirt, and red braces like she'd stepped out of some English 1920s bar after playing a spot of cricket. "You look amazing," I told her as she opened the door. "Thank you," she said and grinned at me. She closed the door behind me, and we were off. Soon we were chatting away about how obsessed we both were with home remodeling shows, and I didn't realize where we were going until she pulled us over, and I looked out the window. Billion Dollar Brand, with a little horse logo. French boutique. A shoe shop I know I saw on one of those lifestyles of the rich and famous shows once. Places you didn't even go into, not even as a joke, in case you sneezed on a tiny top and had to take out a second mortgage to pay for it. Mio must have seen my discomfort when I finally got out of the car. I was clenching my purse and feeling like I was wearing old wheat sacks, rather than actually pretty cute jeans, and a top that, for once, didn't come out of the bargain bin. "You're gorgeous, and the big boss has it bad for you. And these girls in here will take care of you. Have fun." She waved her hand at the boutique behind her, and gave me another wink. She looked so ridiculously cute that I just had to laugh, and I instantly felt better. I walked up to the boutique feeling like I was ready for anything. Before I reached the door, a beautiful girl with dyed red hair and a full-length arm tattoo opened it for me. She gave me a glass of champagne and pulled me inside. It was like a bunch of supermodels had decided to open a boutique. Except these supermodels had tattoos and piercings, and had spent years studying how to not just look sexy but be sexy. "You're Delilah. I'm Alma. Mr. Stone has told us to take very good care of you." She held up her glass, and we clinked them together. "Cheers to sexy billionaires," she said. Cheers to sexy billionaires indeed. That night, Mio pulled us up in front of Mr. Stone Mansion, after driving past a row of cars, each more expensive than the last. I was floating somewhere between "oh my god, I'll never fit in here" and sheer panic, and kept looking down at my blacker-than-black high heels, wondering if anyone had ever fallen to their death from a pair of shoes. Despite my sense of impending doom, I had to say that Mr. Stone certainly had taste. He had selected a range of dresses and shoes for me, none of which would be out of place at the Oscars. One dress, though, had called to me like a siren. It was deep red silk and almost demure at the front, hugging my body and showing off my curves rather than showing all. On the side it was slit up to forever, and at the back dipped down lower than anything else I'd ever worn. Alma had given me a silver chain, which encircled my neck and slid down my back. I'd had a pedicure, manicure, hair treatment and makeup session before they slinked me into the red dress and slipped the high heels onto my feet. "You with the kick-ass dress, we're here," said Mio, opening the car door. I stepped out of the car onto a red carpet, making sure I wasn't going to be flashing anyone. Mr. Henry was waiting by the front door. He smiled at me, making me feel a lot better. "You are a vision," he said as I approached. I blushed and mumbled thanks in return. If I had many more compliments, my head would soon be too big to fit through the door. "If you would come with me," he said. I followed him inside, and heard the murmur of guests to the left. We went up the staircase, and along the corridor to a guest bedroom. It wasn't the same one I'd stayed in, but was just as luxurious. Mr. Henry waved me into the bedroom, gave a small bow, and then closed the door. I turned around to see a pale gold envelope sitting on the middle of the bed. I picked it up and held it to my face and breathed in. Again, it was Mr. Stone. I opened it and pulled out the handwritten note inside. "You must wear what is in the box at the end of the bed. Be warned. Once you put it on, only I can remove it. Remember, you represent me, and I expect you to be calm and collected." I immediately went to the wooden chest sitting at the end of the bed and opened it. Inside was a small golden box. I lifted it out and set it on the bed. Had he left the leather collar for me to wear? I opened the box and found a delicate pair of black underwear with a twist. In the front and underneath was a firm pad, much like the vibrating egg and plug that he'd had me use. However, there was no egg or plug this time. It was just a flat, firm pad which, if I had to guess, probably vibrated. The waistband was also slightly thicker than normal, but honestly I didn't see what was so special about these. What did he mean that once I put these on I wouldn't be able to remove them? Knowing his love of high-tech sex toys, I guess they locked on somehow. I examined the underwear for another minute, and then decided to put them on. He wanted me to wear this while I met people, fine. This was his challenge. I'd walked through a maze with a vibrating plug, an egg inside of me. I slipped into the underwear, and felt the front panel press up against my sex. As soon as I pulled the underwear on, I felt the waistband tighten, and felt it click into place. The only way I was taking these off now was if Mr. Stone unlocked them. Nothing to worry about at all. I was halfway down the corridor when a powerful vibration slammed into me, and I dropped to my knees. It went for about 10 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime of mind-melting pure pleasure. It switched off as quickly as it started, and I started breathing again. My clit was pulsing, and I was on the brink of orgasm already. I held still, afraid that if I moved it would rub against me, and I'd end up a boneless puddle on the ground. A minute or so later I got my heart rate under control, and managed to get to my feet. Whatever these underwear were, they were no simple vibrating sex toy. It was completely silent to start with, yet massively powerful. I prayed to the god of sex toys that what I just felt was the maximum setting. I took deep breaths and walked to the main staircase. Mr. Henry was waiting at the bottom near the door. He smiled at me and waved his hand towards the murmur of people I'd heard earlier. I gripped the handrail and walked down the stairs, still feeling a pulse in my body. Mr. Stone was out there somewhere, and holding the power to vibrate my brains out anytime he wanted. I was going to be calm and collected. I'd orgasm with a straight face if need be. I reached the bottom of the stairs and followed the sounds of the party along the corridor. It turned and led me towards the rear of the mansion, and soon I approached a double set of polished oak doors staffed by a young female butler dressed in black pants, and a white shirt. She smiled and opened the doors for me. I gasped as I stepped through the doors and looked down into the simply enormous room below me. A giant glittering chandelier hung over a sunken ballroom. Bars were spotted about the place, and there were multiple levels and nooks for beautiful people to congregate. Most of the men were in suits of black or gray, and the women ranged from impossibly beautiful demure to impossibly beautiful in something slinky and gorgeous. Light sparkled from the chandelier on diamonds scattered throughout the crowd. I stopped on the edge of the landing and gripped the banister, scanning the room for Mr. Stone. If I could see him, it would be okay. I'd just focus on him. I finally saw him standing near one of the bars talking to a group of gentlemen. He was dressed in a black suit, just like the rest of the men, but somehow it barely seemed to contain him. He looked young and powerful and drop-dead sexy, and I imagined I could hear the ice cubes clinking in the glass of scotch he held. He glanced up at me, and then held my gaze, his face smooth and unreadable. Then he winked and slid his free hand into his jacket pocket. I was so absorbed with seeing him that I didn't realize what him sliding a hand into his pocket meant until it happened. The powerful vibration surged to life and I gripped the banister, holding on so I wouldn't collapse to the ground. Somehow I managed to hold his gaze when all I wanted to do was moan and fold down to the ground. The buzzing stopped and Mr. Stone removed his hand from his jacket and waved at me to come down to him. I took a deep breath, put my shoulders back and, keeping a firm grasp of the banister, walked down the stairs. Halfway down I saw Mr. Stone smile at me, down his scotch, and then excuse himself from the group of men. He met me at the bottom of the stairs and held out his hand to me. I took it and stepped down, feeling like I had floated all the way. "You are beauty itself," he said. He smiled at me, but then winked again, and I suddenly remembered the switch he had in his pocket. At any moment he could press it. "Thank you, sir," I said, the essence of formality. He stepped closer to me, his strong arm encircling my waist, his lips near my ear. I breathed in his scent and felt myself relaxing. "I will tear this dress off you later," Mr. Stone whispered in my ear, and then stepped back. To everyone watching, it may have just looked like a quick embrace, but my heart was thudding at the thought of being with him again. "Now come with me," he said and led me through the crowd. As we approached a group of women gathered around an older woman holding court, a low vibration started, causing me to breath in sharply. Mr. Stone glanced at me, but said nothing. The group of women moved away, leaving the older woman waiting for us. "Jackson Stone, you must learn to return phone calls." She wiggled her finger at him, and he smiled in return. I tried to smile, but even the low buzz was making it difficult to focus. "And who is this beautiful girl?" she added. "Ms. Delilah Neri, my date." "Delilah, this is Andrea Wright, owner of Wright Technologies and currently on the cutting edge of solar panel research and manufacture. #1 in the sun," she deadpanned and held out her hand to me. I smiled and shook it, hoping that the beautiful madman next to me would have the sense to shut off the vibration, so I could talk. The buzzing suddenly ceased, as though he'd read my mind. "Very nice to meet you, Ms. Wright. I've read a lot about you." As I said it, I realized it was actually true. In the mass of contracts and work I'd done this week, I'd read plenty about her and her company. They were simultaneously partners and competitors with Stone Black, sometimes working together, and sometimes competing against each other. "Call me Andrea. All my Swedish tennis instructors do," she said and grinned at me. She laughed and walked away to a young blonde hunk in a suit nearby who handed her a drink. "That's her son, not her tennis instructor," Mr. Stone whispered to me. "She has a strange sense of humor," he added. He smiled at me, and suddenly the buzz was back full power. I felt my knees go weak, and I bit my lip. "How are you feeling, Ms. Neri?" Mr. Stone asked. "Just wonderful," I answered, gritting my teeth. The buzzing stopped, and I managed to hold back my sigh of relief. Another moment, and I would have been on the ground, howling like a mad woman. Mr. Stone led the way again, this time directing me to a handsome man in his early 30s. As we reached him, the vibration started on low again. My business partner, Matt Black. Like his surname, Mr. Black had dark hair and dark eyes that verged on black. I'd seen the odd photograph of him, but never one of he and Mr. Stone together. He was as tall as Mr. Stone, And it was a good thing they were never photographed together, because the sheer sexual energy of that picture would melt any woman into a puddle. "Good to meet you, Delilah," he said and kissed my hand. His eyes were twinkling, like he held some deep secret. But there was something in him that made my skin suddenly crawl. It sounded like he'd said, "Good to meet you, Delilah." The buzzing stopped and I smiled politely at him. "Very good to meet you too," I said and took my hand back. "I have heard so many wonderful things about you from Jackson. Your extraordinary work for the company, how you go to great lengths to provide the very best." He grinned at me, and I felt myself flush red. Had Mr. Stone told him about us together? They were business partners and presumably friends. What did he know? "Always a pleasure," Mr. Stone said in a flat voice. "I hope to see you again," Mr. Black said and winked at me before walking away to join a beautiful woman near the window. I looked at Mr. Stone and saw the expression on his face. It was more than simple annoyance. He was actually angry. Then it washed away, and he smiled at me before leading me across to the bar. He handed me a glass of white wine and ordered a scotch on the rocks for himself. "No one has a photograph of you two together, you know," I said, seeing what I could find out. "Photographs are for friends," he said and swallowed half his scotch in one gulp. I sensed I was walking on thin ice here, but I needed to know more. "Weren't you friends? I thought you started the business dash." "We were. Once," he said and swallowed the rest of the scotch before depositing the glass in the hands of a waiter who appeared from nowhere. "So many questions," he murmured and stroked his fingers down my back. His voice was soft, and he was almost smiling, but I could feel the hard edge under it. Question time was over. I sipped my white wine and missed his hand slipping into his pocket. The vibration started and I clenched the stem of my wine glass, holding on for dear life. I managed to gulp down the wine and set the glass down on the bar before I had to step into Mr. Stone and grab onto him. I simply couldn't hold back anymore. I squeezed my eyes shut, tried to hold my breath, clenched my hands, but nothing worked. Mr. Stone smiled down at me, his eyes absorbing. He pulled me closer and kissed my cheek. "Come now, little slave," he whispered. His words were like the switch in his pocket. I came, shuddering and shaking against him, unable to even hold myself up. The vibration hit a crescendo and then vanished, leaving me trembling in his arms. I felt his hard cock pressing up against me and wanted it inside me. I managed to compose myself, even as I felt ripples of pleasure still flowing through me. "Are you always so obedient?" he murmured to me. "No, sir," I said. I felt his arms tighten around me, pulling me closer. "I want you now," he whispered. He suddenly stepped away, holding me by the hand, and begun pulling me through the crowd. I followed as well as I could, but he moved so quickly I was nearly wrenched off my feet. We practically ran up the stairs, moving so fast I couldn't see if anyone was watching us. As soon as we turned the corner of the corridor leading to his study, he turned and pulled me to him. "You went into my office without permission," he said, his hand stroking down the curve of my back and lightly brushing across my ass. "I was going to fuck you, sir," I answered, twisting his shirt in my hand. He smacked me on the ass, and before I could say anything else, hauled me down the corridor by the arm. I felt like I was being arrested. He hustled me through his study and through the door that was hidden in the wall. A moment later, and he used the small black key to open the dungeon door and pulled me inside. As the indirect lights came on, he dragged me across to a small wooden platform. I stepped up on it without him instructing me to. "Put your hands up," he said, his voice dark. I raised my arms above my head. Mr. Stone stepped closer to me and then ran his hands down my body. Suddenly he tore my dress, splitting it down the middle. The thin straps split in his hands and soon my ridiculously expensive dress was a pile of material on the ground, leaving me topless in the vibrating underwear I couldn't remove and my super high heels. He reached up above me. I looked up and saw Mr. Stone clamp my wrists in leather restraints lined with wool. They were connected to a thick silver chain that hung from a solid wooden beam. Once my arms were restrained, he again stroked his hands down my body, the tips of his fingers lightly brushing my nipples and causing me to moan. "Quiet," he said and swatted me on the ass. He stepped away from me and pulled his phone out of his jacket pocket. He tapped the screen, and the low vibration started again. I was already sensitive from the last orgasm, and so even this made my mind go blank. I managed to keep my mouth shut, however, and my sighs bottled up inside me. Mr. Stone watched me for a moment as I held his gaze. His eyes were dark pools of blue-green, and he looked like he wanted to consume me. "Technology," he said and winked at me before tapping his phone again. The vibration kicked up a notch, and I nearly squealed at the feeling pushing through me. Then I felt my platform move. I thought it was just a wooden step, but it was actually built into the ground. As it slowly sank, I heard the chain above me move. I was soon on tiptoe, my arms stretched above me. The platform stopped in place, leaving me trembling to hold myself in place. "You should not have gone into my office without permission, little slave," he said. He tapped his phone again, and the vibration kicked up to full power. My legs jolted, and suddenly the step was gone, and I was hanging by my wrists. I was completely helpless before him, unable to stop him doing whatever he wanted to me. A moan escaped my lips, and I closed my eyes as the vibration from the underwear surged through me. What had brought me to my knees in the corridor when I first put them on hadn't been full power. I couldn't think. My entire world had shrunk to the sensation between my legs. Suddenly the vibration stopped, and Mr. Stone pulled the underwear off me. He had stripped down, and I barely had a moment to appreciate his cut body before he pulled my legs up and slammed his cock into me. He wrapped his arms around me even as I put my legs around him and started fucking me furiously. He bit my neck and then moved his head down to take a nipple between his teeth. I squealed as he nipped me with his teeth, feeling first the pain and then the hot rush of pleasure. With every stroke of his cock into me, I heard the chain clinking above us. "I need you," he grunted, pulling his hand up to enclose my throat. I couldn't answer because I was gasping with his every movement. I felt his fingers tighten, and between his hand on my throat and his cock pounding into me, I couldn't take it any longer. I cried out as I came again, trying to pull myself onto him, trying to pull myself away from him. I opened my eyes and found he was an inch away from me, our noses nearly touching. I heard him gasp and then felt him come, his arm tightening around me, his hand tensing on my throat. Somewhere between my hitching breaths and aftershocks, he undid the restraints and lowered me to the floor. I leaned against his naked body, hearing his heart thudding in his chest. "Will you be mine?" he asked, stroking my back with his fingers. This time there was no doubt in my mind. "Yes, sir," I said, looking up into his eyes. He turned away from me and picked up his suit jacket, which he'd thrown over a tall wooden bench. He reached into the pocket, pulled out the black leather collar, and turned back towards me. He'd been carrying it with him this entire time, just waiting for this moment. Holding his gaze, I pulled my hair in away from my neck, and then turned my back on him. I heard Mr. Stone move behind me, and then felt the warm band of leather encircle my neck. There was a soft snick as the clasp closed, and with that sound, I knew I was his completely. I turned around to face him, and saw he was watching me, looking into my eyes. But what was he looking for? I raised my fingers to the collar, and felt myself shiver. To be possessed. To be his. To be owned. "I'm yours, sir," I said. He stepped closer to me and kissed me. "I know," he said. With that, he took me by the hand and led me out of the room. For a moment I worried we'd be seen by the party guests, but as soon as we stepped out into the corridor, I realized the guests must have all gone home. The mansion was quiet and still. We stopped off in the guest bedroom to grab 2 thick white robes, and then he led me down the corridor, past the main stairs and down the corridor that stretched off the other side. It turned and we ascended another staircase. I was dizzy enough from the sex, and floating along wearing the collar, but I quickly realized he was taking me to his bedroom. I wasn't going to be sleeping in the guest room, or sent home in a limo with Mio. Soon we reached a set of large black mahogany doors, and Mr. Stone used the small black key again. They opened inwards, and he led me inside before they closed behind us. Against the wall was a simply gigantic bed, like someone had joined 2 king-size beds together, and then decided that wasn't quite enough. As soon as I saw it, I felt a wave of sleepiness wash across me. I wanted to be in it, nestling against Mr. Stone. He led me across the room to the window, and I looked down into the grounds behind the mansion. Tiny solar lights glimmered throughout the garden, and I smiled at the sight of the hedge maze. Mr. Stone stepped behind me and wrapped his arms around my body before gently kissing my neck. I smiled and felt my body tingle as I refocused on his reflection in the window. I had seen angry Mr. Stone. I had seen cold. I had seen furious. Just for a moment, I caught a glimpse of content. Without another word between us, he pulled me away from the window and to his bed. We slipped under the sheets, and my head was only on his chest a moment before I was asleep. The next morning I awoke and found Mr. Stone was gone. I sat up, feeling warm and relaxed, and saw a gold envelope sitting on the end of the bed. I quickly rubbed the sleep out of my eyes and opened it. I will be away on business for the next few days. We will begin your training on Wednesday morning in the office. There is a driver waiting to take you home. Once you have had breakfast, you will learn how to please me. I shivered, imagining all that he had in store for me. Training in the office. What did he mean? I stretched, and then brought the note up to my lips, smelling his faint scent on it. I was still sore and worn out from yesterday, but the scent of him made my skin tingle, and my heart start to beat faster. I suddenly remembered what I'd agreed to, and reached up to feel the leather collar around my neck. I was his. After a shower, I found a pile of clothes in my size in the inn suite that fit me perfectly. I dressed, and then after a quick breakfast prepared by Nadine, Mr. Henry led me out the front of the mansion where a limo was waiting. He opened the door for me, and I slipped inside. "The driver will take you home, miss," said Mr. Henry. "Thank you so much," I said as he closed the door. I gathered it wasn't Mio driving me home this time. The driver kept the barrier up between us, but I barely noticed. I kept touching the collar around my neck and remembering last night. I was so lost in daydreams that I didn't realize I was home until the car stopped. The driver opened the door for me, and I stepped out and almost into him. Mr. Stone, dressed in a tuxedo. I squealed as he grabbed me and pulled him hard against him, our lips meeting in a passionate kiss. He pushed the car door closed behind me, and then I was against the car, feeling his cock press up against me. He finally broke off the kiss, leaving both of us gasping. All I wanted was to fuck him right now. "I will see you Wednesday," he said and gave me a final kiss. "You bastard," I said, panting. He raised an eyebrow at me. "You bastard, sir," I said. He raised his hand to my throat and took hold of the collar with 2 fingers. "You belong to me and you will obey," he said. With that, he moved me away from the car and got back in the driver's seat, leaving me standing on the footpath panting like I'd just run 10 blocks. He drove away, and I didn't know whether to laugh or throw my shoe at the retreating limo. I floated into my building and then took the elevator up to my floor, trying to clear my head, but all I could think about was Mr. Stone. By the time I reached my apartment, I was determined to give myself a cold shower or a good slap in the face so I could regain my senses. But as soon as I stepped inside my door, I felt a cold rush come over me like I'd dived into an ice pool. Sitting on my scarred and battered coffee table was a single A4 photograph. It was a young girl at a protest. She was yelling and holding a Molotov cocktail. Her face was filled with rage and fear. It was me, age 16. I turned the photo over, and stuck on the back was a printout from my hometown local paper. Stone Pharma burnt down in arson attack. I didn't read the article because I knew it by heart. I'd read it a million times when it had been published. A Molotov cocktail was thrown during a protest against Stone Pharma. Their building caught fire and burnt to the ground. A janitor working there had died of smoke inhalation in the basement. Underneath the article was a phone number and a message. "Text I understand and await our instructions." Someone knew who I was. They knew where I lived and had been in my apartment. I pulled out my phone and tried to enter the message, but my hands were shaking too much. Finally, I gave up trying to enter the message and collapsed on the sofa, staring at the photo of my younger self. She had been out of her depth back then, and I was out of my depth right now. She had made stupid decisions back then. Was I about to make a stupid decision right now? I managed to type in "I understand" and hit send.